Hi everyone, my name is Brittany J. Jones. In this video, we are going to be sewing along to the new McCall's 8324. I'm going to be following along with view C on this pattern. And for reference, I'm using 100% rayon fabric and I cut out the size 18. Let's go ahead and review the pattern pieces that we're going to need to cut out to make view C on this pattern. So again, we're going to be sewing along to McCall's 8324. I will be making view C from this pattern. If you need help picking fabrics, remember you can turn on the back of your envelope. There is a list of suggested fabrics. You will also need some notions, so be sure to grab those when you're out getting the supplies for this project. And be sure to check your finished garment measurements and take a look at the bust because we do have different cup sizes here for this pattern. So before you just cut out your size, be sure to check the finished garment measurements. Let's go over the pattern pieces that we need to cut. We will need to cut out pattern piece number 1. This is the front, and we need to cut 1 on the fold. Next, we will need to cut out the side front. For me, I've cut out the C cup, so my pattern number is 3. Yours may be different depending on the cup that you have cut out. So make sure again that you pay attention to the cup size when you're cutting out your pattern pieces. We will need to cut 2 of the side front. Next, we have pattern piece number 5. This is the back. We need to cut 4. Pattern piece number 6, this is our neck binding. We need to cut 1. Pattern piece number 7, this is our loop. We need to cut 1. Pattern piece number 10, this is the tie. We need to cut 2. Pattern piece 11, these are the sleeves. We need to cut 2. And last, we have pattern piece 14. This is the sleeve binding. We need to cut 2. When you're cutting out the loops and the binding, make sure that you pay attention to your grain line so that you're cutting these along the bias. For fabric, I am using a lightweight rayon. Go ahead and transfer all of your markings and let's get started sewing. To begin, we want to take our front pattern piece as well as our backs, and we want to do some stay stitching. Stay stitching for this pattern is done at 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. It's usually done at 1/2 inch, but for this pattern it's done at 1/8 of an inch. So around the neckline of pattern piece number 1 as well as the back, you want to do just a row of stay stitching. You also want to do it along the inner curves here of the front as well as these edges here on the back. Now you don't have to do it all the way down, just right here in the curve section will be plenty. So just between the curves you want to do a row of stay stitching as well as around the neckline. This is going to really keep the fabric from stretching, so do not skip out on the stay stitching. Let's go ahead and do that now. Once you have the stay stitching done, you want to grab some pins as well as your side front. Your pattern number may be different, but mine is a 3. Again, it's according to the cup size that you cut. But with right sides facing, we want to match up our notches. You should have transferred 2 notches along your front piece. They correspond to the 2 notches on the side front. And so we're going to pin there first and then continue pinning the side front in place. Once you get right here around the curve, if you need to place some clips right here on your front piece, you can clip to your stay stitching. Do not clip past the stay stitching, just clip to it. You can just put a few slits in it, and that will give the fabric a little bit more give in this area. Go ahead and pin your other side front to your front the same way. Once you have your side front pinned to your front, you want to go ahead and stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm going to finish off my seams with the serger and then I'm going to press the seam toward the front. Back stitch at the beginning and the end of your stitch. All right, once you have it sewn, make sure that you press your seams going toward the bodice. And if you have a pressing hem, this would be the perfect time to pull it out so that you'll be able to press nicely over that curve and that you're not pressing it flat. It keeps that curve in that shape. So if you have a pressing hem, it'll be the perfect time to use it. Now let's move on to the next step. For the next step, we're gonna move our bodice out of the way and we're gonna grab our loop. For our loop, this is pattern piece number 7. You want to fold it right sides facing, and we're going to stitch along the long edge only at a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And you're going to need a loop turner or a pin or a needle and thread to flip it right side out. Here is my finished loop turner here. I've already stitched it and flipped it right side out, so you will have a really tiny loop once you have it complete. We are going to cut our loop into 6 pieces, measuring 2.5 inches each. So 2.5 inches, 6 times. Go ahead and do that now. Now that we have it cut, we're going to bring the ends together and we're just going to tack them together. So you can do it by hand if you like, or if you want to go to your sewing machine, we're just going to tack it together right here on the ends. I'm going to go ahead and tack mine now. To tack it, I'm going to do it as though I'm sewing on a button. If you have that feature, you can just use that. If not, then I would recommend doing it by hand, just to make sure you keep the edges. You don't want to overlap them, you just want them to be tacked together. So this is what mine look like. You can definitely do this by hand just to tack it before we baste it onto the back. So after you have your loops prepped, go ahead and grab your 2 back pieces here. We are going to match them up with the small circles that we have transferred. So I have one down here at the bottom. I'm going to take a loop and I'm just going to place it right over the dot, making sure that I match up the raw edges of the loop and of the fabric, and I'm going to pin it in place. Okay, I'm going to do the other side the same way. Now that we have them pinned on, we can go to the sewing machine and we're just going to baste them in place. For your basting stitch, be sure to lengthen out your stitch, and we do not need to back stitch. Once you have your loops basted on, now you want to go ahead and grab your other 2 back pieces. Remember, we were supposed to cut out 4. So with right sides facing, we're going to pin this center here as well as the inner curve. Do not pin anything around the neckline, the shoulder, the arm, or the side. We're just right here at the back and this curve. So go ahead and grab your pins. You want to match up your raw edges, match up your notches, and pin in place. Once you have it pinned, you want to go ahead and pin the other one the same way, and then you're going to stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you have it sewn, you want to go ahead and trim, and then we're going to do some understitching. So I am first going to trim my seam down to about 1/4 of an inch. Gonna trim away those corners. With understitching, you want to make sure that you have your seam allowance facing toward your facing. So whichever one you decide to be your facing piece, just make sure you have your seam allowance facing toward your facing, and then you're going to do a row of understitching, and you're going to do it as far as you can go. Let's go ahead and do that now, and then we can press it in place. After you have it pressed, you can baste the raw edges of your neckline, shoulder, armhole, side seam, and the lower edge of the bodice together. Once you have it basted, we are going to stitch our front to back at the shoulder and side seams. So with right sides facing, I'm going to grab my bodice here, the front piece, and I'm going to pin at my shoulders and side seams. Make sure that you match up your notches and pin in place. Pin your other side in place the same way, and then we're going to stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now that we have our shoulders and side seams sewn, we can go ahead and Put this to the side for just a moment, and you want to grab your neck binding. This is pattern piece number 6. You want to fold up along the unnotched edge. You should have transferred some notches. So on your unnotched edge, you're going to fold up a 1/2 inch, press that in place, and then we will trim it down to 3/8 inch. So let's go ahead and do that for our neck binding piece. Okay, I have mine pressed up and trimmed. So now I'm going to grab my bodice, and with right sides facing, we are going to match up our notches as well as the circles that we transferred. They match up to the shoulder seams, and you will have about 5/8 inch on each side of your binding that extends past your neck. So it should extend a little bit after you have it pinned. So this is my dot here, and you can see that there is an extension from the binding. So let's go ahead and pin it in place now. After you have your binding pinned along your neckline, we're going to stitch this in a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Let's go ahead and do that now. Okay, I have my binding sewn on. You want to trim down your seam to a 3/8 inch. So go ahead and trim yours. I've trimmed mine. So now we want to go ahead and press our seam up toward our binding. Then you can press the binding over along the roll line. Make sure that you fold in your ends though. So you want to fold in the ends and then press over the binding like so. So first press your seam going up toward the facing, press in the raw edges, and fold over the binding along the fold line. After you have it pressed, then you can slip stitch it in place. I'm probably going to do a stitch in the ditch for mine. So go ahead and press it and finish off your neck binding with a slip stitch. Okay, I have just sewn my neck binding in place. So I have done more of an edge stitch as opposed to a stitch in the ditch. So you can see my edge stitching, my stitching on my neck binding. But you can go ahead and again finish yours with a slip stitch. On the outside, you do want to get a needle and thread and slip stitch here along the back. So be sure to do that for both sides. For video purposes, I'll just do mine at the end and just close up that opening. But after you have your neck binding complete, we can go ahead and move on to the next step. The next step is actually to do the hem of our top. So I've gone to my pressing station, and you want to fold up the lower edge along the fold line, and then we're going to fold in a 1/4 inch the raw edge, and then I pressed it back down. Once we have that stitched in place, then we are going to slip stitch the opening of the side the same way that we will stitch the opening for the side at our neck binding. So go ahead and stitch it in place first, again stitching close to the inner pressed edge, and then once you're done, you will slip stitch the opening edge right here of the hem. Now that we have finished the hem of our top, now we can go ahead and start to work on our sleeves. So we're going to put this to the side and grab our sleeve pattern. To start on the sleeves, we want to add 2 rows of ease stitching, gathering stitches up here around the sleeve cap. That way we'll be able to ease that into the armhole. After you have done that, then you can stitch down your sleeve seam and finish off your seam. So again, go ahead and grab your sleeve pattern pieces, add your ease stitches, and I've just added mine between the dots that we transferred, and then stitch and finish off the edges of your seam. After you have that done, then we're going to gather the lower edge. When I'm gathering long areas that's like more than just this area here along the sleeve cap, I like to use yarn. I find it to be a lot easier, and it also helps me save a little bit of thread. So I'm just going to gather the lower edge of my sleeve, and using yarn, I'm going to lengthen out my stitch, the length as well as the width. Using a zigzag stitch, I'm just going to stitch over the yarn, and then once I have it in and I'm ready to gather, I can just pull on the yarn and it will gather the fabric as I pull. So go ahead and do your gathering stitches as well on the lower edge of your sleeve now. Okay, I have my gathers add it to the lower edge of my sleeve. Before we start to gather that up, we need to go ahead and prep our sleeve binding. So we're going to grab pattern piece 14. This is our sleeve binding. So we're going to stitch at a 5/8 of an inch, and then we're going to prep the remaining of it the same way that we did for the neck binding. So after you have it stitched and you've pressed the seam open, on the unnotched edge, you will press up a 1/2 inch, and then you will pin this to your sleeve, matching up your seam as well as your notch, and then you will pull together. But first, let's go ahead and stitch it, press it flat, and press up our 1/2 inch and trim it to 3/8 of an inch, and then we can pin it to the sleeve. I have my sleeve binding. I have stitched it, pressed the seam allowance open. I folded up a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then I trimmed it down to 3/8 of an inch and pressed that in place. So now I can go ahead and pin this onto the sleeve. I've already done one, so this is what that looks like here. After you gather up your gathering stitches and pin it to the sleeve binding like so. I'm gonna go ahead and do the other sleeve now. So right sides facing, you want to match up your seams, pin that in place, and then you want to go ahead and pull up on your gathering stitches. You also want to find your notch and match it up with your notch on your sleeve binding and pin that in place. And now I'm going to pull up on my yarn to gather the fabric. Once you have it pinned, we're going to stitch in a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then we're going to finish it off the same way that we did for our neck binding, how we folded over the binding and we stitched it in place with the slip stitch, or whatever method that you used. That's the same exact way we're going to finish off our sleeve binding. Let's go ahead and finish off our sleeves now. Now that we have our sleeve binding finished, I've just finished stitching mine in place. And now I'm going to go ahead and install my sleeve. So with right sides facing, you want to grab your bodice, and you want to take a look at your notches to make sure that you are inserting the right sleeve into the right armhole. First, you're going to match up your seams. So I'm going to match up the side seam of my bodice to my underarm seam on my sleeve, and I'm going to pin that in place first. And now I'm going to flip it over, and I'm going to begin matching up my notches, and I'm also going to match up my circles. I'm going to match those up as well and pin those in place. And I'm also going to start gathering up my threads. The circle at the top of the sleeve matches up to your shoulder seam. So we're going to continue pinning and adjusting our gathers to fit. After you have one sleeve pinned in, you want to pin in your other sleeve. Then we're going to stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and finish off our seams. Once you have your sleeve installed, you can go ahead and steam your seam. And the last thing for us to do is to start to work on the tie. So I'm going to put this to the side, and I'm going to grab pattern piece number 10. We're going to stitch the ends of our tie together and press that open. Once you have it pressed, you want to fold it right sides facing, and we're going to place some pins back here in the back. So we want to leave an opening around the center of the tie. So we're going to stitch a 1/2 inch all the way down the long edge as well as across the short edges. And again, make sure that you leave an opening in the back so we'll be able to flip it right side out. So go ahead and stitch again 1/2 inch down the long edge and the short edges of your tie and leave an opening to flip it out. Once you have it flipped right side out, you want to go ahead and slip stitch your opening close. First give it a press, then slip stitch your opening close, and then you want to do an edge stitch along the short edges and the seamed edge. So the edge that you stitch closed, you want to do an edge stitch all the way down that seam and the short seams. So let's go ahead and press it. First, since we're going to have to do an edge stitch, I'm just going to press mine and then do the edge stitch. I'm not going to slip stitch it closed, but you can slip stitch yours if you prefer. Let's go ahead and do that now. Once you've closed up the opening in your tie, now we can finish up our top. You want to grab a set of hook and eyes. You will need 3, so 3 sets. And on the back opening along the top, you're going to sew the hooks to the right and the eyes to the left. When you're sewing them, make sure that you space them out evenly. So again, you want to stitch your hooks to the right and the eyes onto the left. After you have those sewn on, then you just need to lace up your back depending on if you want your tie at the bottom or at the top. If you want to tie it like view A or view C, once you have that tied, then you are all done. Well, that is all for the video, and I really do hope that you all enjoyed it. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe below, and I will see you in the next one. Blessings, everyone. Bye.